Dorothy Sterling sat in the warden's office, which was now her office, and looked at the single photograph on her otherwise bare metal desk. It was of her and Frank, 50 years younger, standing in front of a half-built house. Frank's arm was around her, his hand resting on the small swell of her belly that would become their son, Michael. They were smiling, not for a camera, but at each other, their faces illuminated by a future they believed they had complete control over. The irony was a physical weight in the small, cold room. From that desk, she commanded a fortress of stone and steel, a place built for punishment that had become a sanctuary. She had turned the county's forgotten scrap into a home, not just for herself and Frank, but for the other forgotten scraps of society. And from this desk, with a pen that cost 99 cents and a ledger book from a dollar store, she had systematically dismantled the financial empire her son had built on the foundations of their betrayal. He thought he had put his mother in the cheapest, most miserable box he could find to save a few dollars a month. He was right about the box. He was wrong about the misery. He had forgotten who she was. He had forgotten that for 40 years, Dorothy Sterling had balanced the books for a construction firm that built skyscrapers. She knew where every single penny went, and now she knew where everyone had gone too. But to understand how they ended up masters of a stone fortress, how a 72-year-old bookkeeper and a 74-year-old carpenter became the unlikely sovereigns of a decommissioned county jail, you have to go back. You have to go back to the quiet house with the big oak tree, the one they built with their own hands, the one they thought they would die in. It started, as most tragedies do, quietly. It started with a phone call. Michael. His voice was different, a smooth, practiced sympathy that felt slick and wrong over the phone lines. He was worried about them, about Dad, Frank, after his fall from the ladder while cleaning the gutters. Just a sprain, the doctor said. A bad one, but it would heal. Frank was already grumbling about the garden needing weeding, his impatience a sure sign of his recovery. He's fine, Michael, Dorothy had said, her voice calm. She was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table Frank had built for her as a wedding present. She could see Frank out the window, stubbornly limping his way to the tool shed. Mom, he's 74. It's not just a sprain. It's a sign, Michael said. And the house, it's too much for you both. The upkeep, the stairs. We manage, she said. The words were clipped. She didn't like the direction this was going. She had heard this tone from him before, when he was closing a deal, convincing a client they needed something they didn't want. Then came Susan, their daughter, on a conference call. Her voice was softer, laced with a genuine, if misguided, concern. Mom, we found this wonderful place. Golden Meadows. It's assisted living, but it's more like a resort. There's a pool, a garden club. You'd love it. They painted a beautiful picture. A life of ease. No more worrying about leaky roofs or property taxes. Everything taken care of. They would sell the house, they said. The market was hot. It would set them up for life, a nice fat nest egg to leave for the grandkids. It was all so logical, so sensible. It was a trap laid with the language of love. Frank was having none of it. I'm not leaving my home, he said, his voice a low rumble. I built this place. Every nail, every board. He looked around the living room, at the fireplace he'd laid stone by stone. But they were persistent. They visited. They brought brochures with glossy photos of smiling seniors playing shuffleboard. They talked about safety, about security, about peace of mind. They chipped away at Frank's resolve and played on Dorothy's pragmatism. The fall had scared her more than she let on. What if she hadn't been home? What if it had been worse? The final push came from Michael. He sat at that same kitchen table, his expensive suit looking out of place against the worn oak. He opened his briefcase and laid out financial statements. He spoke of market volatility, of the rising cost of healthcare. He made their comfortable, debt-free life sound like a precarious house of cards. This is about securing your future, he said, his eyes earnest. Let me handle this. Let me and Susan take care of you for once. It was that line that broke them, the appeal to their lifetime of parenthood, the inversion of roles. They had always taken care of their children. Now, their children wanted to take care of them. It felt right. It felt like the natural order of things. So they agreed. They signed the papers. Power of attorney. documents giving Michael control over the sale of the house and their finances. It felt like a weight lifting. It felt like relief. The move-out day was a blur of boxes and strange men in their home. Dorothy packed a photo of her and Frank building the house. She packed Frank's father's hand plane. She packed 50 years of life into cardboard. Michael supervised, efficient and detached. Susan cried softly in the corner, a performance of grief that Dorothy, in her own haze of sorrow, almost believed. They didn't go to Golden Meadows. There's a bit of a waiting list, Michael explained, his hand on the steering wheel of his luxury sedan. Just a few weeks. We've set you up in a comfortable place in the meantime. It's all arranged. The comfortable place was a motel on the edge of town. The kind of place with a flickering neon sign that read Oasis Motel, and rooms that smelled of stale smoke and pine-scented cleaner. The carpet was thin and stained. The television was bolted to the dresser. It's just temporary, Michael said, avoiding their eyes as he placed their 2 suitcases on the floor. I'll call you tomorrow. He didn't call the next day, or the day after. His phone went straight to voicemail. Susan's did the same. A week passed. Then 2. The prepaid room Michael had arranged for ran out. Dorothy paid for the next week with the cash in her purse. Then she used her debit card. After the 3rd week, the card was declined. Insufficient funds. Dorothy stood at the ATM in the gas station next to the motel, the receipt in her trembling hand. Insufficient funds. It was impossible. They had over $200,000 in their savings and checking accounts, the accumulated discipline of a lifetime. Not a fortune, but a fortress. Their fortress. She called the bank. A polite, indifferent voice on the other end of the line informed her that the joint accounts had been closed. The funds had been transferred. By whom? The authorized user, Mr. Michael Sterling. The world tilted. The fluorescent lights of the gas station seemed to buzz with a malevolent energy. She walked back to the motel room in a daze. Frank was sitting on the edge of the bed, watching a game show with the sound off. He looked up as she came in, saw her face, and the flicker of hope in his eyes died. "What is it?" he asked, his voice quiet. She couldn't say the words. She just handed him the ATM receipt. He stared at it for a long time. He didn't get angry. He didn't yell. A deep, weary sadness settled over him, aging him a decade in a single moment. He folded the small piece of paper carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, as if it were a precious memento. "He sold the house too," she said. It wasn't a question. She had already known, deep down. That was the low point, or what they thought was the low point. They were 72 and 74, with less than $200 to their names, living in a motel room they could no longer afford. They were invisible, discarded. The system they had paid into their whole lives had no immediate answers. The police officer who came to take their report was young and sympathetic, but his eyes held a familiar, bureaucratic glaze. "It's a family matter," he said. "A civil issue. You'll need a lawyer." A lawyer? With what money? They had become a statistic, a sad story you hear about on the local news before the weather report. The elderly couple swindled by their own son. They had to leave the motel. They packed their few belongings into their 20-year-old sedan. That night, they slept in the car in a Walmart parking lot. Frank reclined his seat, his long legs cramped. Dorothy sat upright, watching the endless parade of headlights, her mind a frantic storm of numbers. Assets, liabilities, income, expenses. The bookkeeper in her couldn't shut down. It was the only part of her that still felt functional. They had the car. It was paid for. They had Social Security. About $2,000 a month combined. It was something, a lifeline. But it wasn't enough for a deposit on an apartment, not with their credit now mysteriously ruined. They spent their days in the public library, Frank reading old woodworking magazines, Dorothy on the public computer, scrolling through rental listings that were all hopelessly out of reach. She widened her search. She looked for rooms to rent, for shared housing, for anything. Her search terms became more desperate. Low-income housing, emergency shelter, cheap land. She started looking at county auction sites, at listings for condemned properties, for forgotten parcels of land no one wanted. And that's when she saw it. A listing on the county surplus website. A single, grainy photo of a gray stone building surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. The description was brief, clinical. Property ID 77B4. Location 1400 Old County Road, Havenwood. Structure decommissioned county detention facility. Built 1928. As is condition. Utilities disconnected. Minimum bid $100. She stared at the screen. A jail. An old, abandoned jail. It was absurd. It was insane. It was a block of stone and steel that nobody wanted. She clicked through the attached files. There were floor plans, a warden's office, a small kitchen area, a block of 10 cells, a small infirmary, concrete floors, steel doors, barred windows. It was built to keep people in, to withstand anything. It was a fortress. Frank, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Look at this. Frank shuffled over, his joints stiff from sitting in the car. He peered at the screen over her shoulder. He saw the photo, read the description. He didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss it. He looked at the floor plans, his carpenter's eye tracing the lines, seeing not what was there but what could be. He saw the solid construction, the stone walls that would stand for another 100 years. The sound roofline, noted in the surveyor's report. It's still standing, he said, his voice thoughtful. That was all he needed to say. In those 3 words, Dorothy heard everything. It was a challenge. It was a statement of fact. While their carefully constructed life had crumbled, this forgotten building, this monument to misery, had endured. The auction was online. Dorothy used her library card to log in. She entered a bid. $1. For the next 3 days, she checked the website obsessively. No other bids were placed. Nobody wanted an old jail in the middle of nowhere. On the final day, at the final hour, a notification popped up in her email. Congratulations. You are the winning bidder for property ID 77B 4-inch. She printed the email. It felt unreal. For the price of a lottery ticket, they had bought a jail. The closing costs and back taxes came to just under $600, nearly a third of their remaining cash. It was the most reckless, desperate thing she had ever done. Frank stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder. I'm driving, he said. The drive to Havenwood took them 2 hours, deep into the rural part of the county they'd only ever passed through on their way to somewhere else. The town itself was a small collection of buildings clinging to a two-lane road, a gas station, a diner, a hardware store, a church. Old County Road branched off and turned to gravel after a mile. The jail sat on a small rise, surrounded by overgrown fields. It was exactly as grim as the photo. The stone was dark with age and weather. The barbed wire on the fence was rusted. A heavy padlock secured the front gate. It looked less like a building and more like a scar on the landscape. Frank got out of the car with a pair of bolt cutters he'd bought with their dwindling cash. The chain on the gate snapped with a loud crack that echoed in the silence. The gate creaked open, a sound of protest from decades of disuse. They walked up the cracked concrete path to the heavy steel front door. The key, which they'd received from the county clerk's office, was old and iron. It turned in the lock with a groan. The door swung inward into darkness. The air that rushed out was cold and stale, the smell of dust and decay, and something else, a faint, metallic scent of old sorrow. They stepped inside. The door closed behind them with a solid, final thud. They were standing in what must have been the reception area. A thick layer of dust covered everything. A metal desk sat bolted to the floor. Beyond it, a barred gate led deeper into the building. Frank found a breaker box on the wall. He flipped the main switch. Nothing happened. Of course, the utilities were disconnected. He grunted. First things first, he said. Dorothy explored, her footsteps echoing in the vast silence. She walked through the barred gate into the main cell block. 5 cells on each side of a narrow corridor. The doors were solid steel with a small, barred window at eye level. Inside each cell was a concrete slab for a bed and a simple toilet sink combination unit. It was oppressive. It was dehumanizing. It was home. She found the warden's office. It was small, with a large, barred window that looked out over the front gate. The metal desk was still there. This would be her room, she decided. Her command center. Frank found the kitchen. It was surprisingly functional, with a large, industrial stainless steel sink and countertops. The stove and refrigerator were ancient, likely useless, but the bones were good. He ran his hand along the countertop. Solid, he murmured. They spent the first night in the car, parked just inside the gate. It was too cold, too dark, too daunting to stay inside the jail. As darkness fell, the stone building seemed to absorb the light, becoming a black hole of a silhouette against the starry sky. "What have we done, Frank?" Dorothy asked, her voice a small sound in the confines of the car. Frank didn't answer for a long time. He was looking at the jail. "We bought a rock," he said finally. "Nobody kicks a rock. They just walk around it. We're going to be a rocked." The next morning, their real work began. Frank's first priority was water. The property had a well, according to the county records. He found the wellhead, overgrown with weeds. The pump was manual, a relic from a bygone era. He spent the entire day taking it apart, cleaning the components, re-greasing the joints. His hands, soft from a few years of easy retirement, were quickly scraped and raw. By late afternoon, with a final, protesting squeal, the pump handle moved. And then a gush of brown, silty water, followed by a clear, cold stream. Water. It felt like a miracle. Dorothy's job was communication and supply lines. She drove in a Havenwood. The town was quiet. People watched her from behind the windows of the diner. A stranger in an old car was an event. Her first stop was a hardware store. Hobbs Hardware, the sign read, the paint faded but proud. The inside smelled of sawdust, oil, and old-fashioned competence. An elderly man with a shock of white hair and hands as gnarled as oak roots stood behind the counter. "Help you?" he asked. His eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "I need to speak to someone about getting a generator," Dorothy said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The man grunted. "That'd be me. Earl Hobbs. What kind of generator are you looking for?" She explained their situation. Not the whole story, not the betrayal. Just the part about buying the old jail. She expected him to laugh. He didn't. He just nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on her. "Heard the county finally sold that place," he said. "Figured some fool would buy it eventually." He didn't say it unkindly, just as a statement of fact. He looked past her, out the window, toward the road that led to the jail. "My granddad helped build that place. Laid the stone. Said it was the most honest building in the county." He looked back at her. "You and your husband moving in there?" "We are," Dorothy said. He sized her up, his gaze lingering on her clean but worn clothes, the determined set of her jaw. "Got a used generator in the back. A good one. Diesel. Came off a construction site. Needs a little work, but it's solid. I'll sell it to you for what I paid for it. $300. It was still a huge amount of their remaining money, but she knew, instinctively, that it was a fair price. More than fair. It was an act of something she hadn't encountered in months. Decency. "I'll take it," she said. "I'll have my boy drop it off this afternoon," Earl said. "You'll need fuel, and you'll need to get the county inspector out there before you can get the main power turned back on. Fella named Henderson. He's a stickler for the rules." Earl Hobbs became their first ally. He didn't ask probing questions. He saw two people in need of a foothold, and he provided one. It wasn't charity. It was a transaction, but it was a transaction built on an old code of professional respect. He saw Frank's calloused hands when they came in later that week, and knew he was talking to a fellow tradesman. He sold them wire, copper pipe, and lumber at a discount, calling it a contractor's price. With the generator running, they had light and power. A string of work lights cast long, dancing shadows down the cell block. Frank went to work on the plumbing. He found the main lines were cast iron, solid and intact. He spent a week replacing fixtures, flushing the system, his grunts of effort and occasional curses echoing through the stone halls. Dorothy was his apprentice, handing him wrenches, holding the flashlight, learning the anatomy of their strange new home. One evening, after a day of backbreaking work, Frank got the water heater to kick on. The ancient boiler shuddered to life with a roar. Hot water flowed from the tap in the kitchen sink. Dorothy stood there, letting the scalding water run over her hands, and she started to cry. They were quiet, exhausted tears, Frank came up behind her and put his arms around her. "We're doing it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're building again." They chose 2 cells at the end of the block, side by side. Frank used a cutting torch he'd bought from Earl to remove a section of the bars between them, creating a small suite. One cell was their bedroom, the other a sitting room. He built a bed frame out of scrap lumber. Dorothy bought a mattress from a thrift store in the next town over. It was the first time in months they hadn't slept in a car or a motel bed. The steel door, which they left open, was a constant reminder of where they were, but for the first time, it felt less like a prison and more like a shield. Their life fell into a rhythm. Frank worked on the building, his projects growing in scope. He repaired the roof. He replaced the broken windows with thick panes of plexiglass. He turned the infirmary into a proper bathroom with a working shower. His workshop was in the old Sally Port, his tools neatly arranged. He was a man with a purpose again, and the deep lines of despair on his face began to soften. Dorothy's domain was the warden's office. She managed their finances with painstaking precision. Every penny of their Social Security check was allocated. Fuel for the generator, food, supplies for Frank's work. She set up a small kitchen, cooking on a hot plate. She planted a small garden in the prison yard, turning over the hard-packed earth with a shovel until her back screamed. She planted tomatoes, zucchini, and beans, things that would grow, things that would sustain them. And she began her other project, the one she didn't speak to Frank about. From the public library, she had printed out copies of every transaction from their bank account for the past year. She had requested, through a formal, notarized letter, the closing documents from the sale of their house. Michael, legally obligated as their power of attorney, had to comply. The packet arrived at the Havenwood post office, a thick manila envelope full of his betrayal, itemized and signed. In the warden's office, under the light of a single bare bulb, she went to work. She spread the documents out on the metal desk. With a ruler and a pen, she began to trace the money. She created a ledger. On one side, their assets. On the other, where the money had gone. The house sold for more than Michael had told them, $100,000 more. The money hadn't gone into a trust, as he'd claimed. It had been funneled through a series of shell corporations. His corporations. It was a complex web of deceit, designed to be impenetrable. But Michael had forgotten who his mother was. She had spent a lifetime untangling the complex finances of multi-million-dollar construction projects. Her son's amateurish fraud was an open book to her. She worked late into the night, the only sounds the hum of the generator and the scratching of her pen on the paper. Each entry in her ledger was a nail she was hammering into his coffin. It was slow, meticulous work. It required patience. She had nothing but time. What would you do when the world you built is taken away? When the people you trust most prove to be hollow, what's the first step you take to reclaim yourself? For Dorothy, it was a pen and a ledger. For Frank, it was a hammer and a nail. I'm curious what your tools would be. Let me know in the comments below. And if you're finding some value in this story of resilience, I hope you'll consider hitting that subscribe button. It helps more than you know. Their isolation was broken one rainy Tuesday in October. A beat-up car, even older than theirs, pulled up to the gate. A young woman got out. She couldn't have been more than 20. She was pregnant, her belly a prominent swell under her thin jacket. She looked lost and terrified. Dorothy went out to meet her. The girl flinched as she approached. "Can I help you?" Dorothy asked, her voice gentle. Is this a shelter?" the girl asked, her eyes darting around at the grim stone building. "Someone in town, the lady at the diner. She said you were taking people in." Dorothy was stunned. They weren't taking anyone in. They were just trying to survive. But she looked at the girl, at the desperation in her young face, and she understood. The town had been watching. They had seen the lights come on in the old jail. They had seen the smoke from the new chimney Frank had installed. They had seen the garden, and they had drawn their own conclusions. They had decided what this place was. "What's your name?" Dorothy asked. "Maria," the girl whispered. "Come inside out of the rain, Maria," Dorothy said, and she opened the gate. Maria's story tumbled out in the small, warm kitchen Dorothy had created. She had been living with her boyfriend in the next county over. He was abusive, When she got pregnant, it got worse. She had finally run, with nothing but her car and a few dollars. She had been sleeping in her car for 3 days. Dorothy listened without judgment. She made Maria a cup of tea and a sandwich. Frank came in, wiping grease from his hands on a rag. He saw the girl, took in the situation with a single glance, and simply nodded. That night, Maria slept in one of the empty cells. Dorothy gave her a clean blanket and a pillow. The next morning, Frank began work on her cell, cleaning it, painting the concrete walls a soft yellow. He built her a proper bed frame and a small table. Maria was the first. The snowball had started rolling. A week later, a young man showed up. His name was David. He had been kicked out of his home after telling his parents he was gay. He had heard about the jail from a friend of friend. He was a hard worker, desperate for a place to belong. He fell in with Frank, eager to learn, and quickly became a shadow, helping with the endless list of repairs and improvements. The jail was no longer just a home for two. It was becoming something else, a community, an ecosystem of the discarded. Dorothy assigned rooms, cells, and duties. Maria, whose pregnancy made heavy lifting impossible, took over the kitchen, her cooking filling the sterile halls with the scent of spices and baking bread. David became Frank's apprentice. Dorothy managed the logistics, the budget, the garden. They pooled their resources. Maria had food stamps. David got a part-time job at the gas station in town. It wasn't much, but added to Dorothy and Frank's social security, it created a stable, if meager, budget. The town's perception of them had shifted. They were no longer the strange squatters in the old jail. They were a resource. Earl Hobbs from a hardware store started dropping off damaged bags of concrete and leftover lumber. "Can't sell it," he'd grumble. "Might as well put it to use." The pastor from the Havenwood Community Church began leaving boxes of canned goods and clothes by the gate. It was never framed as charity. It was an offering, a recognition of the new, strange, but functional order they had created. The jail itself was transforming. Frank and David, with a steady supply of donated materials, began to soften the hard edges of the place. They built raised garden beds in the yard. They turned the empty cell block on the other side into a common area, with a mismatched collection of furniture from the thrift store. They even managed to get the old library cart from the Havenwood Library, which was upgrading its systems, and started a small library. Dorothy continued her work in the warden's office, her ledger growing thicker. The web of Michael's deceit was fully mapped. She had account numbers, transfer dates, names of shell corporations. She had the original appraisal of the house and the fraudulent one he had used for the sale. It was a mountain of evidence, cold, hard, and undeniable. She felt no triumph in it, only a grim sense of purpose. This was a debt that had to be settled. Not for her, not for the money, but for the principle, for the simple, brutal fact that what he had done was wrong. The first major threat to their new world came not from their past, but from the present. It arrived in the form of a white county-issued sedan. A man in a crisp shirt and tie, holding a clipboard, stepped out. "Mr. Henderson," he said, extending a hand that Dorothy did not take. "County Code Enforcement." He was there, he explained, because of an anonymous complaint. A complaint about an unpermitted residential structure, about zoning violations, about an unlicensed group home. He walked through the jail, his face a mask of professional disapproval. He made notes on his clipboard. He pointed out the ungrounded wiring for the generator. He noted the lack of proper fire exits. He questioned the sanitation of the well water. "This facility is not zoned for residential use," he stated, his tone final, "and it fails to meet dozens of safety codes. I'm afraid I have no choice but to issue a condemnation notice. You'll have 30 days to vacate the premises." The notice, a bright orange sticker he slapped on the steel front door, felt like a death sentence. 30 days. Where would they go? Where would Maria, now only a month from her due date, have her baby? Where would David go? Despair settled over the jail, thicker than the winter fog. For the first time since they had arrived, Frank seemed to lose his will. He sat in the common area, staring at the orange sticker visible through the door's window, his hands idle for the first time in months. But Dorothy was not a bookkeeper for nothing. She knew that every system, even a bureaucratic one, had rules, and rules could be followed. She read the condemnation notice again and again. It listed every violation in excruciating detail, and at the bottom, it listed the procedure for appeal. They could request a formal inspection to demonstrate compliance. "It's a list," she told the small group gathered in the kitchen that night. Her voice was steady, calm, just like a grocery list. "We just have to get everything on the list." It seemed impossible. The list of violations was 3 pages long. They would need a licensed electrician, a licensed plumber, architectural plans. They would need thousands of dollars they didn't have. The next morning, Dorothy drove into town. She didn't know what she was going to do. She just knew she couldn't stay still. She stopped at the hardware store. Earl Hobbs was behind the counter, as always. "Saw Henderson's car head out your way yesterday," he said, his voice neutral. Figured he wasn't delivering a welcome basket. Dorothy laid the list of violations on the counter. "He's shutting us down," she said. Earl picked up the papers. He read through them slowly, his lips moving slightly. He grunted. "Henderson's a pain in the backside, but he's not wrong. This is standard stuff." He tapped a section on the list. "Electrical. That's the big one. You need a master electrician to sign off on the work." "We can't afford an electrician, Earl," Dorothy said, the words tasting like defeat. Earl looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the old rotary phone on his counter. He dialed a number from memory. "Walt," he said into the receiver. "Earl, got a situation out at the old jail." "Yeah, that's the one." "No, listen. These are good people. He's a carpenter. The real deal. They're in a jam. Henderson's on their case." "Yeah, I know you're retired. That's why I'm calling. You're the only one cantankerous enough to do it. Just come take a look." He hung up the phone. "Walt's a retired electrician," he explained. "Best in the county. Grumpy as a bear with a toothache, but honest. He'll be out this afternoon." Walt arrived in a rusty pickup truck. He was even older than Frank, rail-thin and with a perpetual scowl. He walked through the jail with Frank, pointing and grumbling. "Amateur hour," he muttered, looking at the generator hookup. Could have burned the whole place down. But as he walked, he also saw Frank's work. He saw the solid plumbing repairs. He saw the clean, sturdy carpentry. He recognized a fellow craftsman. "All right," he said at the end of his tour. "Here's the deal. I'm not supposed to be doing this. My license is inactive, but I can consult. I'll tell you exactly what you need to do to get up to code. You and the boy," he nodded at David, "you do the work. I'll inspect it. If it's done right, I'll see about reactivating my license for one last job. To sign off on it." He wouldn't take any money. "Call it a professional courtesy," he grumbled. "Can't stand to see Henderson win." The community, the one they had built by accident, rallied around them. Walt the electrician became a fixture, directing Frank and David with gruff precision. Earl Hobbs provided the necessary supplies, putting it all on a tab that he never mentioned. The pastor, hearing of their plight, organized a work day. A dozen people from his congregation showed up one Saturday. They painted walls. They installed fire extinguishers. They helped dig a new trench for a proper grounding wire for the generator. They worked frantically against the clock. The 30 days dwindled. They were a team, fueled by coffee and Maria's sandwiches. Frank and David worked from dawn until long after dusk, their bodies aching but their spirits driven. Dorothy coordinated it all, her checklist on a clipboard, making sure every single item on Henderson's list was addressed. The day before the deadline, they were ready. The jail was transformed. The wiring was neat and secure in conduits. The plumbing was up to code. The fire exits were clearly marked. It was clean, safe, and functional. Just as they were finishing, a car pulled up to the gate. Not a county car, a sleek, black sedan, the kind Michael drove. It was him. He got out of the car, looking thinner, his expensive suit looking rumpled. He saw the people, the activity, the transformed building, and his face was a mixture of confusion and anger. "What is all this?" he demanded, walking toward Dorothy. "I heard, in town, they said you were living here. I thought it was a joke." "It's not a joke, Michael," Dorothy said. Her voice was calm, devoid of heat. She was holding her clipboard. She felt strangely detached, as if she were observing a business transaction. "This is insane," he said, gesturing wildly. A jail? And with all these freeloaders? This is what you've done with your life. We have built a home, Frank said, stepping forward. He stood next to Dorothy, his presence a solid wall. David stood behind him. Something you know nothing about. I did what I had to do. Michael's voice rose, becoming shrill. You were a liability. The house, the money, it was all going to be eaten up by medical bills. I secured it. For the family. For my children. You stole it, Dorothy said, the two words landing with the force of a physical blow. You stole our home, our savings, our life. You left us to die in a motel room. It was a business decision, he shouted. And in that moment, Dorothy saw him for what he was. Not a son, not a monster, just a small, weak man who had dressed up his greed in the language of prudence. He had balanced his own books and found his parents wanting. You should go, Michael, she said. Her voice was quiet, but held the finality of a steel door slamming shut. You are not welcome here. He stared at her, his mouth opening and closing. He looked for an ally, for some sign of weakness. He found none. He was an outsider here. He had no power here. He got back in his car and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. The confrontation was draining, but it was also clarifying. It severed the last, withered cord of their old life. Their future was here, in this stone building, with this strange new family. The next day, Mr. Henderson arrived for the final inspection. He walked through with his clipboard, his face unreadable. He checked the electrical panel. He tested the water pressure. He measured the width of the hallways. He spent 2 hours going over every detail, while the small community held its collective breath. Finally, he stood in the common area, the old cell block now clean and bright. He clicked his pen. He looked at Dorothy, at Frank, at Walt the electrician who had shown up to oversee the inspection. Well, he said slowly, it's unconventional. I'll give you that. He flipped through his notes. But it's all up to code. Everything on the list has been addressed. He looked around, a flicker of something like amazement in his eyes. You've done a remarkable job. This isn't a jail anymore. He took the orange sticker off the door, folded it, and put it in his pocket. I'll file the report, he said. I'll recommend a zoning variance for a multi-family dwelling. It'll have to go before the county board, but with my report, it should pass. He actually smiled. A small, tight smile. Good luck to you folks. The cheer that went up as his car pulled away was deafening. They had done it. They had faced the system on its own terms, and they had won. Their rock was now a legitimate, recognized home. The vindication was sweet, but Dorothy's work was not done. The next day, she took her ledger, her thick file of documents, and a small, framed photograph. The one of her and Frank building their first house. She had an appointment. She had made it weeks ago. Her niece, Susan's daughter, Sarah, had just passed the bar exam. She was a newly minted assistant district attorney in the city. Dorothy had called her, not as a grandmother, but as a prospective client with a case of elder fraud. Sarah met her in a small, sterile conference room. She was bright, professional, and horrified as Dorothy calmly laid out the entire story, document by document. The fraudulent sale, the shell corporations, the stolen life savings. He did this, Sarah whispered, her face pale as she looked at the evidence against her own uncle. He did, Dorothy said. She pushed the ledger across the table. Every penny is accounted for. Sarah spent an hour reviewing the file. Her initial shock gave way to a cold, professional anger. This is airtight, Aunt Dorothy, she said. This isn't just a civil case. This is criminal. Grand larceny. Forgery. Wire fraud. She looked at her great-aunt, her eyes filled with a new respect. What do you want to do? I want you to do your job, Dorothy said simply. The aftermath was swift and brutal. With Dorothy's meticulous evidence, the district attorney's office moved quickly. They froze Michael's assets. They issued warrants. The story, when it broke, was a sensation. Financiers swindles elderly parents who build new life in abandoned jail. The local paper ran a front-page story. A television crew showed up at their gate. Frank, intensely private, refused to speak to them, but the story told itself. The image of the repurposed jail, the thriving garden, the community of misfits, was more powerful than any interview. Michael's empire, built on a foundation of lies, crumbled. Faced with an ironclad case, he took a plea bargain. He was sentenced to 5 to 7 years in prison. The court ordered full financial restitution. The money, or what was left of it after his lavish spending, was returned. The house, which he had been living in, was seized and sold, the proceeds going to them. Dorothy and Frank didn't want the money, not for themselves. They used it to buy the jail outright from the county, securing their home forever. They established a non-profit foundation to run the place, ensuring it would continue long after they were gone. They had the main power line connected. They installed a proper heating system. They turned the remaining cells into comfortable private rooms. The jail, which they officially renamed the Haven, became a local legend, a symbol of resilience. More people came. A veteran struggling with PTSD. A family who had lost their home in a fire. It was never large, never more than a dozen people at a time. It was a place for people to land, to catch their breath, to rebuild. One spring afternoon, a year after Michael's sentencing, another car pulled up to the gate. Almudist, sensibel sedan. It was Susan. She looked older, worn down by the shame and chaos of the past year. She had divorced her husband, who had been complicit in Michael's scheme, and was working a simple retail job. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just stood at the gate, her face streaked with tears. Dorothy walked out to meet her. They stood in silence for a long time, the gate between them. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Susan finally whispered. "I was weak. I let him convince me it was for the best. I never stopped feeling guilty. Not for a single day." Dorothy looked at her daughter, at the genuine remorse in her eyes. She saw the years of weakness, of being led by her more forceful brother. It wasn't an excuse, but it was a reason. She unlocked the gate and swung it open. "The door's open, Susan," she said. Life settled into a new, peaceful normal. Susan became a regular visitor, then a volunteer. She helped in the garden, read stories to the children of the family staying there, and slowly, painstakingly, began to mend a relationship she had helped to break. She never asked for anything. She just showed up. Maria had her baby, a healthy little girl named Hope. She lived at the Haven for another year before getting on her feet, finding a job and her own small apartment in town. But she came back every Sunday for dinner. The Haven was her daughter's first home, its residents her first family. Frank spent his days in his workshop, teaching David the finer points of woodworking. He built rocking chairs and tables, his hands sure and steady. He never spoke of Michael. He had cut the name out of his life like a piece of rotten wood. His forgiveness was in his work, in the home he built and protected. One cool evening in late summer, Dorothy and Frank sat on the small porch Frank had built off the warden's office. It overlooked the garden, which was now overflowing with produce. A single, bright porch light, the first permanent fixture Frank had installed, cast a warm glow. They could hear the faint sounds of laughter from the common room. Dorothy was looking at the old photograph, the one she now kept on the small table between their two chairs. The photo of the two of them, young and full of dreams, in front of their first house. For a long time, looking at it had brought a sharp pang of pain, of loss. But now it was different. Frank reached over and took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, but his touch was as gentle as it had been 50 years ago. "You know," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I think this is the best house we ever built." Dorothy looked from a photograph of the young couple to the face of the man beside her, his features carved by time and hardship and love. She looked out at the stone fortress that had become a sanctuary, at the light spilling from its windows into the twilight. He was right. The first house was made of wood and nails. This one was made of something stronger. It was made of stone and steel, but it was held together by resilience. The light on the porch stayed on all night, every night. It wasn't a beacon for ships or a warning to intruders. It was just a light, a small, steady point of warmth in the darkness, a quiet declaration that even in the most forgotten of places, a home could be made. And it was enough.